two electronics technicians vanished on August 17, 1966. 3 days later, they were found dead on a hillside in Brazil, wearing crude lead masks over their eyes. Their names were Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana. They were not hiding. The masks did not cover their faces. They covered only their eyes, like protective visors cut from sheets of lead. Their bodies lay on Morro do Vintém, a hillside above Niterói, across Guanabara Bay from Rio de Janeiro. Around them were objects that looked arranged rather than abandoned: raincoats, towels, a water bottle, scraps of paper, and a notebook. There were no obvious signs of a fight, no clear wounds, no weapon that explained what happened. And the most important evidence was not what police found. It was what they could not find: a cause of death. Before the case became known as the Lead Masks case, Manuel and Miguel were working men from Campos dos Goitacazes. Both were electronics technicians, part of a trade that carried a certain fascination in the mid-1960s. Radios, televisions, circuits, tubes, wires, and signals were reshaping daily life. To many people, electronics seemed to deal with forces that were invisible but real: waves, transmissions, energy moving through the air. Manuel and Miguel understood that world practically. They repaired and worked with devices. They had families, routines, and reasons to travel for work. When they left home on August 17th, their trip did not immediately look like a disappearance. They were said to be traveling for business connected to electronics. But that journey would become the last confirmed movement of their lives. Brazil in 1966 was under military rule, but ordinary life continued in familiar ways. People worked, traveled between cities, visited shops, borrowed money, and followed business opportunities. Campos dos Goitacazes was inland from the better-known coastal centers. Niterói, across the bay from Rio, had its own neighborhoods, shops, hills, and overlooks. Morro do Vintém was not a famous destination. It was the kind of elevated, exposed place where a person could go with a purpose and still remain mostly unnoticed. For Manuel and Miguel's families, there was no obvious reason their trip should have ended there. Investigators would later have to rebuild the men's final day from fragments. On Wednesday, August 17, 1966, Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana left Campos dos Goitacazes and traveled toward Niterói. They were moving away from home, but not outside the pattern of normal life. Technicians could travel to buy parts, meet contacts, or handle business. Nothing at the beginning of the trip proved they were in danger. Once in Niterói, witnesses later placed them buying raincoats. That detail mattered because raincoats would later be found near the bodies. They also acquired water. A bottle was later connected to the scene. One shopkeeper remembered the men as focused, even anxious. One of them was said to be checking the time repeatedly. That observation became more significant when investigators examined a note connected to the case. The note, written in Portuguese, laid out a schedule. It instructed the men to be at a designated place at 4:30 p.m. At 6:30 p.m., they were to ingest capsules. Then, they were to await the effect, protect metals, and wait for the mask signal. Stripped of every rumor that later attached itself to the case, the note remains one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence. It reads like instructions for a timed event. It suggests that Manuel and Miguel were not wandering randomly. They were following a plan. By late afternoon on August 17th, the two technicians were no longer simply traveling through Niterói. They were moving toward Morro do Vintém with raincoats, a bottle of water, and a written sequence that led them toward a specific hour. 3 days later, on Saturday, August 20th, 1966, their bodies were discovered on the hillside. By then, the bodies had been exposed to heat, weather, and time. Decomposition had already begun to damage the very evidence investigators needed most. Police found Manuel and Miguel lying close to one another on rough ground. They were dressed, and later accounts described them as formally dressed. Their raincoats were with them. Over their eyes were the lead masks that would give the case its name, the mystery of the lead masks. The masks were not disguises. They did not hide who the men were. They were crude, functional-looking shields, cut from lead into the shape of eye coverings. Lead is associated with protection from radiation and certain kinds of energy, which made the masks appear intentional. But they protected only the eyes, and they were too crude to explain themselves as ordinary safety equipment. Nearby, investigators found items that suggested preparation: towels, the water bottle, scraps of paper, and the notebook. The objects did not create a clear story, but they did not look like random debris either. The scene raised a series of basic problems. There was no obvious violence, no confirmed trauma, no weapon, no immediate explanation for why two men would die together in the same place after apparently following a schedule. The autopsies did not solve it. Because the bodies had been outdoors for days, forensic examination was already compromised. The cause of death could not be determined. That single failure became the center of the case. Without a cause of death, investigators had no confirmed mechanism, no proven poison, no established method of homicide, no clear accident, no medical conclusion that could explain why both men died on that hill. The note pointed toward capsules, but no capsules were found at the scene. That absence became one of the most important facts in the case. If Manuel and Miguel swallowed capsules at 6:30 p.m., as the note instructed, then the capsules may have been central to their deaths. But investigators had no substance to test, no container, no usable chemical trail. Toxicology either could not be meaningfully performed or did not produce a result that explained the deaths. The investigation had instructions to ingest something, but not the thing itself. From there, the case moved into the space between evidence and interpretation. The men's profession immediately shaped how people understood the masks and the note. They were electronics technicians. They worked with circuits, signals, and invisible forms of energy. In the 1960s, the language of electronics often overlapped with spiritualist and pseudo-scientific ideas. In Brazil, as in other countries, some people were fascinated by the idea that technology might allow contact with unseen forces. Later discussion of the case would often move in that direction. People suggested experiments, signals, capsules, or some kind of private ritual, but the verified core remains much smaller and much stronger. Two electronics technicians left home on August 17, 1966, traveled to Niterói, bought items later found near them, followed or carried a note with timed instructions, and were found dead 3 days later on Morro do Vintém, wearing lead masks over their eyes. The first major theory is that Manuel and Miguel were participating in a spiritualist or pseudo-scientific experiment that went wrong. The note supports the possibility of a planned ritual or test, a fixed time, a designated place, capsules, masks, and a signal. The lead masks could have been meant as protection from something they expected to witness or receive. Their electronics background may have made ideas about energy, waves, or invisible forces feel plausible to them. This theory also explains why there were no signs of struggle. If they went willingly, they may have believed they were in control. But the theory stops at the edge of the evidence. It does not identify the capsules. It does not explain the mask signal. It does not prove who gave the instructions or whether anyone else was present. It can describe a possible belief system, but it cannot prove what physically killed them. A second theory is homicide disguised as ritual. Under this view, someone may have lured Manuel and Miguel to Niterói by using their technical interests, business plans, or personal beliefs. If the men expected to meet someone, buy equipment, or participate in an experiment, they may have trusted the person who guided them. The strange objects at the scene, the masks, the note, the timed instructions, could have been used to make the deaths look voluntary or mysterious. This theory explains the possibility of manipulation. It also accounts for why the scene feels staged, but it has the same critical weakness. Without a cause of death, there is no confirmed method. Investigators could not point to a weapon, a proven poison, or an established act of violence. There were also reports that the men carried money, but what remained afterward did not settle the question of robbery. If money was part of the motive, the evidence did not close that path. If robbery was not the motive, the purpose of the journey remained unclear. A third theory is accidental poisoning. The note's instruction to ingest capsules makes this one difficult to ignore. Manuel and Miguel may have taken a drug, chemical, or sedative, believing it would create a controlled effect. They may have expected the capsules to be part of an experiment. The lack of violence and the organized nature of the scene could fit a voluntary act that became fatal. But again, the strongest clue is also the missing piece. No capsules were recovered. No tested substance confirmed poisoning. The bodies were too decomposed for the kind of clear answer investigators needed. The written instruction remained, but the physical evidence did not. Every theory has to deal with the same central contradiction. The scene looks prepared, but the purpose is unknown. The note suggests timing, but the event is unidentified. The masks suggest protection, but not from anything confirmed. The capsules may explain the deaths, but they vanished from the scene. What remains is a narrow, unsettling timeline. On August 17th, Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana left their families in Campos dos Goitacazes. They traveled to Niterói. They bought raincoats and water. At least one witness later remembered anxious attention to the time. A note connected to the case instructed them to be at a designated place at 4:30 p.m., ingest capsules at 6:30 p.m., await the effect, protect metals, and wait for a mask signal. On August 20th, their bodies were found on Morro do Vintém. They were close together. They had raincoats, towels, a bottle, papers, and a notebook. Their eyes were covered with crude lead masks. There were no obvious signs of a fight. The autopsies did not establish a cause of death. The capsules mentioned in the note were gone. That is why the lead masks case has endured. Not because every rumor is equally likely, but because the confirmed evidence forms a pattern that appears deliberate without ever becoming clear. Two technicians walked into a planned moment. They carried objects that matched written instructions. They covered their eyes with lead. They waited for something. And whatever happened on that hillside left no confirmed cause of death behind. What were Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana really waiting for on Morro do Vintém at 6:30 p.m.? Follow Whispered Cases for a new case every week. Subscribe so you never miss one.